Are you filming?
Yes.
Okay, hi Dad. This is how you make pizza. So, this dough is 4 ingredients: flour, water, salt, and yeast. And really all it is about measurements and ratios, and it's pretty simple. So, Uni, and there's other third parties, have an app that help you figure out these measurements. So I'm gonna point out a couple key features. One is the number of dough balls. We'll be making 6 dough balls because 5 of us, we'd like to have 1 extra for everyone else to munch on. And they're gonna weigh, this says they're 230 grams. They'll come out to a little bit lighter than that. There tends to be a little bit of loss. 65% hydration. That is the water, that's water relative to how much flour there is in the dough. And you always want 3% salt. And then once you have in these numbers, it gives you a calculation of that you need 821 grams of flour, 534 grams of water, 25 grams of salt. It says 1.1 grams of yeast. However, I tend to just use a 1/4 tablespoon and that works. Okay, so obviously here, like, I make it by hand a lot, but I'm gonna use the mixer because it makes cleanup a whole lot easier. And your hands don't get as messed up. So I'm gonna start with the water. I said earlier we're using 534 grams of water. This is the bowl for the mixer, and I'm just gonna start.
Oh wow, I nailed it. Like actually though.
Nice.
Did not expect to do that, I'm proud. Okay, so we're gonna attach this to the mixer.
Okay, so yeast. This is just the standard yeast from the fridge, the commercial yeast. So I tend to, for this amount of dough, I'm just gonna use a 1/4 teaspoon of yeast. And especially when you're fermenting it for a long period of time, that is more than enough. It's like if I'm doing same day dough, I do it in the morning for it to be ready at night, and that's around like 7 to 8 hours. This is an overnight dough, and I'm still gonna go ahead and use a 1/4 teaspoon. And it's probably more than that because I'm doing a pretty generous scoop, but that's just how I like to do yeast. And then salt, so you wanna do 3% salt, which the app does the math for you. Does the math for you to tell me that I need 25 grams of salt. However, to do it by hand, it's pretty simple. So we're using 821 grams of flour. And so you do times 0.03 to get approximately 25 grams of salt. All right, so now I'm gonna measure out my 25 grams of salt.
Oh shit, that's more than 25 grams. I got carried away.
I'm gonna keep the salt off to the side because you don't want the salt and the yeast to intermingle directly because the salt will kill off the yeast. So I let that sit there for a little bit while the yeast is in the water right now, sort of getting a little bit dissolved and woken up. So now I'm gonna do the flour, doing 821 grams of flour. And whenever you're at Mazzaro's, look for this bag. It's Caputo, and it is tipo 00. This is used by some of the most famous pizza makers in Naples. All right, so the rest of this bag was about 570. So I'm gonna crack open this bag to top it off. So, very cool. So now I'm gonna start, so I've weighed out the flour, I've weighed out the salt, I have the yeast sitting in the water right here. I'm now gonna fire up the mixer. I'm gonna put it on kind of a low speed while I start to dump in the flour. All right, it works. It probably works better to put in bits of flour while the mixer is not mixing. And so I'm gonna let it run now. This is a side note, so as you may have seen in that footage, as I was trying to put in the flour while the mixer was spinning, it causes it to spill, so my recommendation is to not have the motor running and drop in the flour and then let it mix a little bit and then put it in doses. And now is probably a decent time for me to add the salt. Adding flour and just sort of gradually let it get incorporated into the dough. Okay, so if you look at the dough, it has come together, like it's fully incorporated, and you can tell because there's little to no flour residue on the sides of the bowl. However, it's still kind of wet and sticky, and I'm going to now start kneading it by hand in order to get it smoother. All right, let me make sure it's all... Technically don't need to be slapping and folding, but it's fun. Slap and fold is for much wetter dough. Pizza dough does well with just good old-fashioned hand kneading.
Yeah, if I were doing 70% dough, I wouldn't slap and fold, but that's what I was doing for the sourdough. Interesting.
So I've been kneading here for about maybe 2 or 3 minutes. The machine did a lot of the work for me. And as you can see, this dough ball is quite a bit smoother on the surface. One tell you can do is when you poke it, it starts to spring back. That's how you know that it's starting to gain the structure it needs. However, I'm going to come back to it. I'm going to cover it with this bowl for about 5 minutes while I wash my hands and put all this stuff away, and then I'll come back to it. All right, so I've come back to the dough after about 5 odd minutes, and I'm back to kneading it, and it's a lot easier to knead, and it's a lot smoother in texture. That's because in the couple of minutes I was away from it, the gluten strands relaxed, and so they're a lot more pliable. Kneading is all about creating gluten, which gives the dough the structure it needs to stay intact. Okay, so I've done a little bit more kneading, and you can see it's even smoother on the surface. However, I am gonna let it rest. I poke it and it springs back. However, I'm gonna let it rest for just a few more minutes, and then I'm gonna show you one thing you can do to indicate that your dough is ready. All right, so I've let the dough rest for a little bit longer, just to let it relax one more time. I'm now gonna demonstrate what's called the window pane test. This is how you can tell if your dough is ready to begin the ferment. So I'm gonna take a piece of the dough and I'm gonna stretch it as much as I possibly can until it is translucent, so where I can start to see some light pass through it, and notice that it's not ripping when I do that. That means that there's a sufficient gluten structure within the dough and that it is strong enough. Okay, so I've, after doing the window pane test, I've just smoothed it out one more time into a nice top ball. You can see that the surface is perfectly silky smooth. And now we're gonna begin the fermentation process. So I'm gonna take this bowl, spray it down real good with olive oil, and I'm going to place it in there like so, and cover it with a towel. And in this particular case, it's gonna stay in the fridge overnight, but if you're doing same day dough, it's going to rest at room temperature for about 2 or so hours. Okay, so it's been about close to 15 hours or so, and this dough has been resting nicely in the fridge. And so now what we're about to do is, it's about 3 hours out from when we're gonna start cooking, so I'm gonna portion the dough into individual dough balls. So the way I do that is I weigh the dough in the bowl, and I know for a fact that this bowl weighs 1,555 grams. And I see on the scale it says 2,911, so I type in 2,911 minus 1,555 to get 1,356, and then I divide that by 6 to see that each dough ball will weigh 226. I'm gonna spray down my work surface so it doesn't stick. And I'm going to use the scraper to extract the dough from its bowl. It's very cold and dense from being in the fridge all night. And I'm gonna start portioning it into pieces.
And you're still filming for some reason. Why am I filming the technique?
Okay, so I've now weighed out a piece to my specified weight. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm now going to roll it into a dough ball. So in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to tuck the corners in like so. And then I'm going to start I sort of cup it with my hands, but then what I like to do is I cup it against the counter. So if you see here, I'm spinning it with the edges of my pinkies, and I'm pulling back to create friction against the table until you have a nice sort of smooth, even taut ball. And then I use these containers, which I'm now going to spray down nice and good, where it will rest for the next 3 or so hours and come to room temperature. Okay, so I've now portioned out all of my dough balls. They're resting in these containers, and because I did this dough in the fridge overnight, it's gonna spend the next 3 or so hours coming to room temperature. They'll probably rise a bit, and then we will flatten them out and top them and bake them in our Uni wood-fired oven. I wish you the best in your pizza making endeavors. Shut up, Anthony.